New York in 1899. The city was at the height of its Gilded Age. Money flowed like the Hudson River. Marble mansions rose along Fifth Avenue, and dinners with French wine and gleaming carriages became the language of power. The rich flaunted their wealth, and the poor toiled to serve the extravagant dreams of the upper class. But amidst all this glitz and glamour, there was a place the city's most powerful people sought out in silence. A place they never mentioned at parties, never made appointments for, and if asked about, they would smile as if they'd never heard of it. The four-story brownstone at 5 East 44th Street had no sign, no brightly lit windows, no clue to what lay behind those thick walls. Unless invited, you would never know it existed. Yet this was Manhattan's most exclusive address, an underground haven for the elite, where the fate of vast fortunes could vanish overnight. Around 10 p.m., as Broadway theaters dimmed and lavish dinners at Delmonico's concluded, horse-drawn carriages began to pull up before the house's heavy doors. Well-dressed men disembarked, bankers, R.A., ill-road tycoons, steel magnates, men who could make the stock market fluctuate with a nod. They looked around cautiously, then stepped onto the steps and knocked on the unmarked wooden door. Behind that door lay a completely different world, a world separate from law, politics, and the outwardly respectable faces of the day. A world where those who made the laws were also the secret breakers of them when night fell. The press at the time called it the Palace of Sin, the gambling den of the super-rich, a place that shook the morals of the entire city. But for those who sought it out, it wasn't a casino. They called it by another name, the finest private club in America. The most sophisticated private club in America. The man behind it all wasn't a billionaire, a politician, or an aristocrat. He was a former handyman, a former convict who taught himself to enter a world no one wanted him to enter. A man with the keen ability to read other people's desires like a surgeon, and who understood their weaknesses deeper than they understood themselves. Richard Albert Canfield. He didn't just run a casino, he created a ritual, a stage, a sanctuary of desire wrapped in silk and crystal lights. Throughout the late 19th century, 5 East 44th Street was like a secret country nestled in the heart of Manhattan. No law could touch it. No newspaper dared name its patrons. And no one really knew what went on inside, except for those with enough money, power, and willingness to make the trade to enter. That was the New York that Richard Canfield conquered. And to understand how a man of humble origins could build such a luxurious underground empire that it addicted even the elite, one must go back to where he began, a small, declining port city where A.L. library-obsessed boy learned his first lessons about human nature. To understand who Richard Canfield became in that mysterious New York house, we must begin in a place seemingly completely unrelated to the world of gambling, a small New England port city where the smell of whaling oil was once the scent of prosperity. New Bedford, Massachusetts, mid-19th century. The golden age of whaling was coming to an end. The large ships that once carried the hope of returning with gleaming barrels of oil now sat in the harbor, old and dilapidated. Kerosene, cheaper, more efficient, had completely replaced the liquid gold that the city once relied on. It was here, in 1855, that Richard Albert Canfield was born. Not into a wealthy family, nor into abject poverty. His father was a mechanic, sometimes selling goods to supplement his income. The family had enough to eat, but lacked what New Bedford had given generations before, a direct path to wealth. There were no private schools, no money for advanced education, no relatives who owned a company to offer a backdoor for a child's future. Richard grew up in a world losing opportunities it once had, and for a boy without privilege, this disadvantage was even more apparent. But that dying city bestowed upon him another treasure, the public library. In an era when many children spent their time at the docks, running errands or dreaming of sea voyages, Richard was drawn to the bookshelves that he read everything. At first, he devoured indiscriminately adventure stories, history, geography, even technical books he didn't fully understand. But the more he read, the more he discovered a new world, philosophy. Kant and Hegel filled his mind with vague concepts. But then he found a name that changed everything. Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said that life is a cycle of desire and suffering. that people often cannot control their own actions, that we lose not because the world is unfair, but because we don't know what we truly want. To a boy living in a decaying city, that pessimistic voice sounded strangely real. Richard looked around and realized. The drunken sailors in the tavern, the once rich families now destitute, the men pouring money into train tickets hoping for a new opportunity, all were chasing desires they couldn't control. And from that, a truth began to form in the young man's mind that would later become the foundation of the empire he built. If you understand what people want, what they truly want, then you can predict, even guide, their behavior. But philosophy wasn't the only thing he learned from the library. During those months of observing the world with keen eyes, Richard began to notice a pastime of men at that time: gambling, not the desperate game of chance, but a strange combination of psychology, mathematics, and something very close to the philosophy of human nature. Richard saw gamblers deceiving themselves, believing they could reverse their fate with a single card. He saw subtle signs: a slight tremor in the hand when placing a large bet, a shifty glance when overly confident, a short breath before the final bet. And what truly intrigued him wasn't winning or losing, but why people kept playing even knowing they would usually lose. By day, he pondered Schopenhauer. By night, he stood behind gamblers in shabby taverns, observing will and desire at work in practice. No one knew at the time that he was teaching himself two subjects that would shape his entire life: the philosophy of humanity and the mechanisms of desire. And from a dying New Bedford, another Richard Canfield was quietly taking shape. One who understood that most people don't fail because of bad luck, but because they never know when to stop. As Richard Canfield entered his youth, the world around him began to split into two distinct halves: the half of ideas and the half of instincts. By day, he lived in the first world. By night, he observed the second, and unexpectedly, this very contrast created the extraordinary genius of this man. During the day, Canfield did jobs that a young man without a degree or family background could do: loading and unloading goods, doing odd jobs, waiting tables, delivering packages. Jobs that required no skills and offered no future. But each evening, after work, while his peers flocked to pubs to drown their sorrows, he would turn in a different direction: the library. There, in the warm light and the gentle rustling of papers, a different Canfield emerged. He read to open a door for himself that society, circumstances, and his background would never open for him. Today it's Kant and the division between phenomenon and essence. Tomorrow it's Hegel and the spirals of history. But Richard wasn't a scholar. He didn't read to argue. He read to understand humanity. Then Schopenhauer arrived like a bolt of lightning, a philosopher who spoke directly to what Richard had long felt: that humans are driven by primal desires, that they don't understand themselves, and that they can be driven down a path of self-destruction while still believing they are in control. For Richard, philosophy wasn't theory. It was a tool for decoding. Night, he left the library and entered a completely different world. Underground casinos, makeshift card tables and taverns, where men sought the fairness life wouldn't give them. In cards, dice, or roulette at first, Richard just watched. He observed how things worked, like a student looking at a model in a lab. And he discovered something others overlooked: the game table was like life. It exposed every weakness. An overconfident man would bet big to prove himself. A desperate man would bet everything just to forget reality. A man wanting to impress would take risks in front of the crowd. A bewildered person would only need a glance from the dealer to waver. Every small movement, a blink of an eye, the way chips were stacked, the rhythm of breathing, gave Richard more data. He learned to read people like reading a book, surprisingly quickly. And what fascinated him most wasn't the game, but the players. They lost for reasons so similar, almost mathematical. Desire drove them to play. Hope kept them going, and blindness caused them to lose. Everything Schopenhauer wrote in his book. Richard saw it all in those smoke-filled rooms. That he didn't gamble much. When he did, he always won small and left the table early. Unlike others, Richard wasn't captivated by the game itself. He was captivated by the mechanics of failure. Gradually, he understood something bigger. The casinos at that time were filthy, chaotic, full of cheating and violence. They existed because the poor had no other entertainment options. Casino owners tried every way to cheat customers. Customers tried to cheat the casino owners in return to in that environment. Richard realized a truth no one else saw. You don't need to cheat to win. People will lose on their own. Just give them a reason to stay at the table longer. That's when the seed of a dangerous but brilliant idea was sown. What would happen if there were a casino operating like a gentleman's club? Clean, polite, safe, no cheating, no noise. A place where the rich can lose money, but still feel they've experienced a special kind of power. That idea was naive, just intuition, but it would shape Richard Canfield's entire life. A self-taught boy in the library, standing in a dilapidated study room, saw the future of American gambling, a future wrapped in silk, wine, art, and sophistication, yet based on a simple truth. People always think they can conquer their own desires, and Richard Canfield understood this better than anyone. It wasn't fate, but their own desires that would defeat them. By the mid-1870s, Richard Canfield understood people, especially gamblers, more deeply than most men twice his age, but psychological understanding was only part of the story. Richard needed a place to test it, and the opportunity arose in 1876 when he decided to leave New Bedford and head to Providence, a more dynamic city with more merchants and also more shabby casinos. In Providence, Richard took up dealing cards at small casinos operating in the shadows. He learned their workings from the inside. The bribes to pay, how casino owners hid money, how they cheated, and how they were constantly visited by the police for mishandling payments. But in that chaos, Canfield saw something else, a gap between need and reality. The casinos of that era were filthy, filled with swearing, drunken patrons, and rude owners. A quick glance was enough to understand. No wealthy man would want to enter one, but Richard believed that need existed. The wealthy, from merchants to factory owners, also desired the thrill of risk. They just hadn't found a place clean enough for them to dare enter. And so his first idea began to take shape. A casino unlike any other, polite, elegant, no cheating, no noise. A place where the rich could gamble while maintaining their dignity, that a place where the feeling of luxury made people more willing to lose. In 1876, Richard used all his savings to open a small establishment. It wasn't large, but it was clean, orderly, with carefully chosen tables and chairs, pristine curtains, and soft lighting. Most importantly, no drunkenness and no fighting. Staff had to dress smartly and speak politely. And especially, no cheating customers to other casino owners. This was madness. But to Canfield, it was strategy. He believed that if customers felt respected, they would return. If they suspected being cheated, they would never come back. And strangely enough, Canfield's establishment began attracting exactly the kind of people he wanted, polite businessmen seeking discreet entertainment. But that success didn't last. Just a few months later, the police raided. The casino was closed, the assets confiscated, and Richard, only 21 years old, was sentenced to 6 months in prison for operating an illegal gambling establishment. For most young men at that time, this would have been the end. Imprisonment meant loss of honor, loss of job opportunities, loss of a future, but Canfield wasn't one to let fate decide his life for him. Providence Prison had a small library, and Richard turned it into his own personal university. During those 6 months, he read systematically, this time not to escape life, but to prepare for the next. He studied art history, architecture, and European decorative styles. That he read about wine, cuisine, things the wealthy used to distinguish themselves from the common people. He studied the biographies of successful people, politicians, self-made entrepreneurs, tycoons who broke ethical boundaries to build empires. That he realized this. Many of the most successful people in history didn't follow the right path. Railway kings bribed officials. Oil tycoons had destroyed their rivals through underhanded tactics. Compared to them, a clean, unbiased, and trouble-free casino might even be healthier. And in the quiet of prison, Richard understood that if righteous society wouldn't give him a chance, he would create his own, beyond its limits, but in his own way. That prison space, with its cold stone walls and dim light, didn't break him. It sharpened him. And when the prison doors opened in 1877, Richard Canfield emerged not with the shame of a captive, but with the plan of a man who had seen the future. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and he knew better than anyone else. The empire he intended to build would be larger than anything he had ever touched. When Richard Canfield emerged from prison in 1877, he was not a defeated man. He left prison as if he had just completed a special course, a course on people, on the spice of luxury, and on how the wealthy defined class. No diplomas hung on the wall, but in his mind was a detailed map to the future. Back in Providence, Canfield started again, but this time with the confidence of someone who had solved a problem that other casino owners hadn't seen. He reopened a new establishment, more refined, cleaner, and more disciplined. Guests had to dress smartly. Staff had to behave as if serving in a private club. No excessive drinking and no swearing. No extravagance, no cheating. And from here, the gentleman's casino model was officially formed. Canfield wasn't targeting the impoverished, hot-tempered, and easily disturbed crowds who frequented the old casinos. He was targeting wealthy men, men who wanted a discreet, undignified place of entertainment, and most importantly, a place where they could lose money without feeling humiliated. And strangely enough, the model worked. Gradually, whispers began circulating in Providence about a completely different casino, where players were well served, the games were fair, and no one had to worry about being dragged into a fight. Wealthy businessmen passing through the city heard about it and tried it. They found a casino they had never imagined. And upon returning to Boston or New York, they told their friends about it as a delightful discovery. For Richard, each such customer was a sign that he was on the right track. During this time, another quiet interest began to blossom within him. Art. Whenever he earned a considerable sum, he didn't spend it like other gamblers. He went to small galleries, looked at paintings, listened to the shopkeepers talk about colors, schools, and styles that he read books about Rembrandt, about the Dutch school, about French artists. A refined aesthetic sense gradually formed in his mind, something no one would have thought a young casino owner could possess. Between the card tables and the paintings, Richard Canfield was creating a dual identity for himself. A casino owner who understood the mathematics of desire, and a man who loved beauty in his own unique way. In 1885, he married Genevieve Martin. Few people knew much about her, and that was exactly what he wanted. Canfield always kept his private life and his work separate. Genevieve lived a peaceful life, uninvolved in her husband's illegal activities. At night, he disappeared into the world of casinos. By day, he returned to the quietude of a respectable family. These two parallel lives existed peacefully, until Canfield realized what he had known all along. Providence was too small for his ambitions. No matter how successful the model, the city was just a small pond. The people he served were well off, but not the tycoons who could squander tens of thousands of dollars in a single evening. Not the kind of people who needed discreet entertainment to protect their reputation. Not the kind of people who would trade social power for a few hours of risk. All those people lived in another city, the only city where money flowed in like a waterfall and extravagance was considered a language of power: New York. In 1888, after nearly a decade of honing his model, building his reputation, and accumulating capital, Richard Canfield made the most important decision of his life. He sold his entire Providence establishment, closing the first chapter of his journey. And with a small but sufficient sum of money to get started, a few good suits, and a vision no one in the gambling industry had ever considered, he boarded a train heading toward Manhattan. Providence was just a rehearsal. New York was the real stage, and Canfield believed that. If he could conquer that city, then the whole of America would remember his name, though they would never dare utter it aloud. When Richard Canfield arrived in New York in 1888, he entered a city unlike any he had ever known. If Providence was a small pond, Manhattan was an ocean, a world where money, power, and ambition swirled together like an unstoppable whirlwind. This was the age of names that had become legendary. Rockefeller dominated oil, Carnegie controlled steel. J.P. Morgan held the nation's financial system in his hands. These men and dozens of others lived in opulent mansions on Fifth Avenue, spending money not for ostentation, but to assert their position in an unspoken race among the elite. And like everyone else, they needed a place to relieve the pressure, a place where they could experience the kind of risk life wouldn't allow, because in business, they had to win. But in the shadows, at night, they wanted a place where they could lose. New York was full of underground casinos, but none suited these men. They were dirty, chaotic, rigged, and most importantly, not discreet enough to protect the reputation of their wealthy clients. Canfield knew he couldn't become king overnight. He had to learn the rules of the game, not the written rules, but the rules of New York's underworld. The opportunity arose when he met David Duff, a seasoned casino owner running an establishment near Madison Square. Duff knew how to grease the wheels of the system, knowing who to pay, when, and how much. In exchange for Canfield's investment and improvements to the casino's quality, Duff agreed to bring him into his underground network. And so, Richard entered his second university, New York's underworld, where every lesson was paid for with real money and real risk. Here, he understood that Tammany Hall was not just a political organization. It was the machine upon which the entire illegal ecosystem of the city relied. Casinos, brothels, bootleg bars, all survived thanks to a chain of protection money flowing from the owners to the local police, to the commanders, and finally into the pockets of political figures sitting in lavish offices. Not paying, collapse. Paying the wrong person, collapse. Making noise, collapse even faster. But for Canfield, this wasn't a threat. It was the operating rule. And if there was a rule, he could play by it, as long as it helped him achieve his bigger goal. For several years, Canfield observed the New York market with the meticulousness of a scientist. He frequented the city's most famous casinos, not to gamble, but to see who the customers were, what they needed, and what they disliked. He noticed the lighting, the way the dealers spoke, the way the managers handled disputes. He realized they all made the same mistake. They treated the rich like the poor, only differing in the stakes. But Canfield knew the rich didn't want a place that allowed them to gamble. They wanted a place that was worthy of them. Each night at Madison Square, he reinforced his belief that his idea, a luxurious, discreet, and cheating-free casino, was not only feasible, but something the market craved that no one else offered. Canfield began building relationships with businessmen, factory owners, and stockbrokers. He never mentioned gambling. He simply talked about books, art, and food, topics that made it hard to believe he was a casino operator. And it was this intelligence and sophistication that made the upper class begin to remember him. He wasn't selling them entertainment. He was selling them the feeling that he was in the same league as them, even though he wasn't. But that was the first step toward getting them to willingly enter his house and bet sums they'd never dared bet anywhere else. By 1893, Canfield had learned every lesson New York could teach him as a behind-the-scenes figure. It was time to step onto the stage. It was time to step into his own spotlight. And he did what ambitious people do. He bought a casino on West 26th Street, renovated it in a style no one had ever done before, and began building the Richard Canfield brand, the springboard to an empire that would make all of New York envious. New York is a city of opportunists, but only Richard Canfield saw something no one else realized. The rich don't need a place to win. They need a place to lose, but lose with elegance, secrecy, and power. And Canfield was ready to build that place. In 1893, after years of observation and learning, Richard Canfield felt he had grasped all the necessary variables for success in New York. He understood the clientele, that he understood the protection racket. He understood the difference between the wealthy New Yorkers and the wealthy anywhere else. More importantly, he understood that no one in the city was serving that class properly. That's when he decided to step out of David Duff's shadow and become the frontman of his own stage. Canfield chose a house at 22 West 26th Street, near Madison Square Garden, the city center at the time, bustling enough not to arouse suspicion, but discreet enough to conceal his powerful clients. The purchase price of the property and the accompanying protection racket amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, equivalent to several $1 million today. To others, it was a reckless gamble. For Canfield, it was just the entrance fee to a game he was certain he would win. As soon as he took ownership, he began a complete overhaul. The dilapidated casino he had seen when he first arrived in New York was gone. No more gloom, thick smoke, arguments, or crashing chairs. Canfield wanted to create a completely different world. He hired the best carpenters to make faro and roulette tables from walnut wood. He ordered Persian carpets, velvet curtains, and European-style chandeliers. He hired a French chef, something unprecedented in any casino in the city. He hired staff based on communication skills, attitude, and composure, not just experience. Canfield wasn't just opening a casino, he was creating a pilot version of an exclusive club for the elite, where the quality of service had to be even higher than that of a good restaurant. No one understood why he would spend so much money and effort just to serve people who came there to lose. But Canfield understood something others didn't. Luxury makes people willing to lose control. When they feel treated like royalty, they open their wallets like royalty, and that model was far more successful than expected. Within months, West 26th Street became the unofficial meeting place for stock speculators, company owners seeking a different kind of risk than trading stocks, and wealthy entrepreneurs looking for a change of pace without losing face. They came out of curiosity. They returned for the experience, and they recommended friends because of the feeling of being part of something secret. Many gambled there night after night, not because they believed they would win, but because they believed Canfield would never cheat them. For a casino of that era, that was extremely rare. And Canfield kept his word. He didn't cheat. He didn't manipulate the cards. He didn't use any tricks that he didn't need to. He knew that the math was on the house side, and he just needed the customers to sit at the table long enough. That honesty wasn't ethics. It was strategy, but an incredibly effective strategy. Deep down, however, Canfield understood that West 26th Street was just a stepping stone, not a place to prove his model worked. A place to build a reputation that was good enough, sophisticated enough, classy enough, but he wanted more. He wanted an establishment that would overwhelm the elite, captivate them upon entering, and leave them, having lost money but still proud to have been there. He wanted a true palace, not just for gambling, but to showcase his own power over New York. And in the late 1890s, with the model a resounding success, Richard Canfield began searching for a worthy place to build the pinnacle of his career. Unlike other casino owners who only thought about making money tonight, Canfield thought about legacy. He wanted to create the most luxurious, discreet, and exclusive casino in America. A place that could rival London's gentlemen's clubs, yet located right in the heart of Manhattan. And then he found it. An old brownstone on East 44th Street, once owned by the Delmonico family, an icon of New York's high-end dining scene, at a house that would become legendary. An address whose number alone would make America's richest men's hearts race. But that story is for the next chapter. In the late 1890s, Richard Canfield accomplished something few thought possible. He opened a casino on West 26th Street, operating discreetly but prosperously, attracting the very class he targeted. Wealthy, successful men eager for risk in a sophisticated setting. But for Canfield, that success was only a draft. He didn't want to be just a good casino owner. He wanted to be the most sophisticated casino owner in America, a place luxurious enough to rival the private clubs of London or Monte Carlo, but nestled in the heart of Manhattan. To achieve that, he needed a completely new space, a place not just for tables, but for creating an experience, an atmosphere blending power, art, and temptation. A place large enough to contain his ambitions, yet discreet enough to hide everything from the press and the police. Canfield began his search. He scoured Manhattan, from the quiet neighborhoods of Murray Hill to the upscale blocks near Fifth Avenue. Most of the homes he looked at didn't meet his standards, either too new, too conspicuous, or located in a residential area where clients couldn't enter discreetly. Canfield needed a place that was both luxurious and private, yet close enough to the heart of the elite so that clients would feel a sense of belonging. Then, he found it. On East 44th Street, just steps from Fifth Avenue, stood a four-story brownstone house that had once belonged to the Delmonico family, the name behind New York's most famous restaurant. A house that exuded an air of high society, but was past its prime and about to be put up for sale. The location was perfect in every sense. Just a few houses away was Delmonico's, where the powerful held their lavish evenings. Just east was the row of mansions on Fifth Avenue, homes of tycoons, industrialists, men who 2 hours earlier had signed contracts that shook the American economy. And just 2 blocks south was the Grand Central Depot, where wealthy patrons from across the country flocked to Manhattan. All the roads to the world of the elite intersected, right at 44th Street. If there was a place that could become the gambling palace Canfield envisioned, it was this house. But he didn't buy it directly. He understood that his name, associated with casinos, shouldn't appear on any paperwork that might draw attention. Through an intermediary, he negotiated and acquired the brownstone for about $200,000, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Many. That's a crazy amount for a house. To Canfield, it was the foundational investment of his entire empire. Immediately after purchasing it, he began a complete reconstruction of the house. Not repairs, but transformation. In Canfield's imagination, 5 East 44th Street was no longer an ordinary townhouse. It was a stage, a museum, a secret club. A world where guests, upon entering, felt instantly detached from the rest of Manhattan. What he wanted was not just beautiful architecture, but atmosphere. He wanted to create a place where, upon entering, guests would forget their daytime moral codes, forget the pressures of work, forget family responsibilities. A place that would make them feel like special men, empowered to do things they would never dare to do in the open. Space would be the greatest weapon. Space would make guests stay longer. And staying longer meant taking a bigger gamble. Canfield understood that better than anyone. And so, construction began. He hired the finest carpenters to panel the walls with precious wood. He chose Persian carpets, crystal chandeliers, and European paintings, not to show off wealth, but to create a sense of power and sophistication. He designed the entrance to resemble a private club, not a casino, and he dedicated the ground floor to a high-end kitchen, unprecedented in the history of American casinos. Canfield didn't want guests to come, gamble, and leave. He wanted them to stay the whole night, because he knew, when people are relaxed, they let their guard down. When they feel safe, they lose more. By the end of 1899, the house was finished. A space so different that anyone who entered had to pause for a few seconds to breathe, as if they had stepped into another world, a more luxurious version of New York, where normal rules no longer apply. 5 East 44th Street is no longer Delmonico's home, but it's the Canfield Club, America's most beautiful secret casino. The place where the nation's most powerful men are about to gamble away their money, honor, and sometimes even their futures, in absolute silence. When Richard Canfield bought the house on East 44th Street, he didn't just buy 4 floors of wood and stone, he bought a skeleton waiting to be brought to life. In his mind, every detail, from the wall color, the material of the gaming tables, to the lighting on the ceiling, had to evoke the same feeling. This isn't a casino. This is a ritual. And he set about transforming the building into the greatest work of his life. The ground floor was the first place guests entered, and therefore had to be subtle enough to dispel any suspicion that it was an illegal operation. When the doors opened, guests didn't see chips, didn't hear the sound of cards being flipped. Instead, they encountered a tranquil foyer, like stepping into the lounge of a private British club. The wood walls were deeply polished, reflecting the warm yellow light. Velvet-covered armchairs were strategically placed, creating private spaces for small conversations. The carpet was so thick that footsteps seemed to disappear. On the table were evening newspapers, a few selected books, and fresh flowers changed daily. Nothing said it was a casino. But every detail whispered, only those who belong here. And the person controlling the door was incredibly important. The doorman, who remembered all the regulars, knew who was invited and who wasn't. No introduction, no entry. Not the right demeanor? Also no entry. Canfield understood that power lay not only in what he allowed, but also in what he refused. Inside, the upper floors of the house were where battles between money and human nature took place. But instead of a noisy card room, Canfield designed a space that could immerse people in such luxury that they forgot they were gambling illegally. He hired top interior decorators, using walnut wood, damask silk, hand-woven Persian carpets, and crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. The gaming tables were handcrafted, with leather-covered tabletops and rounded edges, like the furniture in a high-end villa. The dealers wore impeccably tailored black suits, maintaining a calm demeanor and speaking in a measured tone. Canfield knew that if he wanted America's richest people to come here and spend lavishly, they had to feel that the entire space was created specifically for them. But what made 5 East 44th Street unique wasn't the interior. It was the paintings on the walls. From Providence to New York, Canfield had nurtured his passion for art as a secret. Now he was using it to shape the casino in an unprecedented way. He transformed it into a true art gallery, not copied paintings, not cheap paintings. But these were works by prestigious contemporary artists, and at the heart of that collection stood the man Canfield respected more than any other artist, James McNeill Whistler. Whistler, famous for arrangement in gray and black No. 1, also known as Whistler's mother, was one of the greatest names in Western art at the time. Suddenly, Canfield not only bought his paintings, but also commissioned Whistler to paint a portrait of himself. That a strange combination, an international painter and an illegal casino owner. But these two men found common ground: perfectionism, discipline, and the belief that beauty, whether in painting or in a casino, must be created through meticulousness and ambition. In his London studio, Whistler required Canfield to sit for hours without moving. He corrected every small detail, observing every expression. Canfield, accustomed to calmness at the table, became the ideal model: patient, steady, and uncomplaining. The portrait was never fully completed by Whistler before his death, but Canfield considered it his spiritual treasure, a symbol of recognition no one else in the gambling industry had ever received. When the painting hung in 5 East 44th Street, it became a statement. This is not a casino. This is an art salon, an elite club, a parallel world for those with the right to enter. No casino before, and no casino after, could replicate the blend of art and gambling that Canfield had achieved, but he didn't stop there. He created a high-class kitchen on the ground floor, hiring a French chef to prepare exquisite dinners, a completely new model for an underground casino. Because Canfield understood a simple truth: a well-fed, well-served, and self-important man will lose more money and be happier when he loses. Canfield didn't deceive them. He made them deceive themselves, with luxury, artistry, and a sense of privilege. When the house was completed at the end of 1899, Manhattan had no idea that a legend had just been built. But the city's most powerful men would soon know, and they would vie to enter through those doors. For Richard Canfield's casino wasn't a place to gamble, that it was a ritual. A ritual of power, of desire, and of self-delusion in the golden light of a secret palace. BY 1902. 5 East 44th Street was no longer a secret, but the most closely guarded secret of Manhattan's elite. The most powerful people in America knew of it, but no one mentioned it publicly. No invitations, no signs, no advertisements. Yet, every night, after 10 o'clock, that quiet brownstone became the center of a world no newspaper dared to write about. A world of risk, money, pride, and self-destruction. So what was a typical night like at the Canfield Club? Around 9:45 p.m., 44th Street was still peaceful. Outside, it was dark, the streetlights a soft yellow. Horse-drawn carriages and early cars quietly pulled up in front of the building, and one hurried out. All maintained the composure of someone who had just left a party or a club meeting. But in reality, they were there to do something that society openly opposed, and they did it with the self-assurance of someone who knew the rules didn't apply to them. A man in formal attire approached the door and knocked softly. No timekeeping, no flashing lights, no sirens. The doorman peered through the crack, recognized the familiar face, bowed, and opened the door. No one was allowed in without prior notice. Here, there were no strangers. Entering the ground floor, no one saw gambling. Only silence, the faint scent of wood, warm lighting, Whistler paintings covering the walls like a private art gallery. Guests sat down, a glass of wine poured without question. They exchanged polite conversations, no one mentioning the real reason they were there. Many would be surprised to learn that Canfield rarely appeared in gambling rooms. He didn't like standing too close to where money was being spent. He was a distant observer, an experienced designer, not a customer pusher. His guests, tycoons, politicians, railroad magnates, market speculators, ascended the stairs as gently as if entering a private library. And then, when the upstairs doors opened, the real world of Canfield was revealed. The gaming rooms were a subtle blend of luxury and tranquility. No shouting, no chaos, no loud music. Only the sound of cards being flipped, chips being placed on the table, and an invisible pressure that coursed through the room like electricity. The dealers wore black suits, their postures firm, their hands moving with mechanical precision. On the walls were high-value works of art, not for show, but to make guests feel they were participating in an elite ritual, not a low-stakes game of chance. The most popular game remained faro, simple, fast, and perfect for those who liked to bet big. The roulette wheel spun gently in the next room, the lights reflecting off the small white ball like a small play on fate. The minimum bet? $25, equivalent to nearly $800 today. But almost no one bet the minimum. This was where a few $1,000 was just the beginning. The men who had shaken the stock market with a single decision were now betting on the cards with emotions they would never dare show in the office. Ni yoruto wa itadakemasu. Because here, one thing was known. No one came to win. They came to try their luck, to challenge themselves, to escape from everything they were burdened with. As midnight approached, the smell of hot food from downstairs began to waft up. Canfield's French chef prepared high-end restaurant standard dinners. Soup, roast veal, salmon, dessert, and wine. Some diners left their tables to eat. Others enjoyed the snacks while playing. No one left. Some played until 3 a.m., 5 a.m., even until dawn, leaving the house on 44th Street with thousands of dollars lighter in their pockets. But the strangest thing was, no one showed any resentment when they lost. Canfield created an atmosphere where they felt they had just experienced something beautiful, not a failure. Losing money here was like paying to enter a luxurious, sophisticated, and forbidden world, a world only the chosen could touch. No one blamed Canfield, because Canfield never cheated, never manipulated, never forced anyone to play. He only needed to provide the perfect setting, and people would reveal all the weaknesses in their own nature. The night ended, and guests left through discreet side entrances. Out on the street, dawn broke, and the city returned to its usual chaos. No one knew that just hours earlier, inside that quiet house, hundreds of thousands of dollars had changed hands. It was a typical night at the Canfield Club, a night where power was tested, honor hung on the line, and America's richest men sought to lose money beautifully. At the beginning of the 20th century, nowhere in New York could compare to the Canfield Club in terms of both discretion and allure. Not just for its luxury, not just for its food, not just for its late-night dinners. What made it legendary were the people who walked through its doors. Ordinary people never knew their names. But history did point one of the most famous and tragic patrons was Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, a member of the powerful Vanderbilt family. He was young, handsome, and so rich he never had to worry about money. But like many born into wealth, Reginald carried an invisible void, a burning desire to prove himself through games he knew he would lose. The Canfield Club was the perfect place for that. Reginald walked in not like a regular customer. He walked in as if stepping onto a stage, where luck would decide his honor in a matter of hours. Some nights, he won a small fortune. But other nights, he lost enough to buy a house that it was rumored that in one drunken night, Vanderbilt lost $300,000, equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. No one knew the exact amount, as Canfield never revealed the secret. But in the eyes of those who witnessed it, Reginald didn't lose because of the cards. He lost because he was addicted to the feeling of being himself, something that Vanderbilt's status never allowed him. Canfield never encouraged him to play again. He simply observed from afar, like a philosopher silently taking notes on human nature. But Vanderbilt was just one of dozens of powerful names who had entered this place. Railroad tycoons, after a day of vying for control of the nation's transportation empire, come here to bet on cards instead of stocks. Steel magnates, who propelled America into the industrial age, come here to loosen the control they held so tightly in the real world. A few senators, who draft laws by day, find ways to escape the very laws they are writing at night. No1 is invited, No1 is turned away, as long as they are bailed out. That door opens to those in power, but closes to the ordinary. Once, a famous banker walked in with a heavy heart. He had hidden his anxieties all day negotiating contracts, persuading shareholders, keeping stock prices from collapsing. But when he entered the card room, he let out a long sigh. As if he had just shaken off a heavy burden, he said something that several dealers remember forever. "Tonight, let fate decide for me." The man lost a large sum, but when he left, his face was relieved, for the first time in years, he was free to lose. That's what the Canfield Club offered, the privilege of losing. Even artists and writers sought it out. Some great writers of the time, those who wrote about morality and society, secretly sat in the card room to contemplate the nature of desire. Some painters visited just to see how Canfield displayed his paintings. Some didn't play. They just wanted to observe the world of the rich in their most vulnerable moments. Some once said, "If you want to know who a man is, look at how he bets, not how he makes money." At 5 East 44th Street, America's richest men revealed their true nature. Some are as cold as steel. Some tremble when placing a bet. Some struggle against fate. Some surrender to it. And standing in the distance, never gambling, never drawing attention, is Richard Canfield, the man who understands them better than anyone else. Some ask, why are these wealthy and powerful people willing to trade money for something illegal? The answer doesn't lie in the LAW.IT, lies in human nature. The Canfield Club is the only place where they are truly free. Freedom to lose, freedom to be weak, freedom to be reckless, freedom to take risks without judgment. Freedom not to be the man society demands they be. For a few hours each night, a corporate chairman becomes a challenger to fate that a tycoon becomes a gambler desperate for victory. A congressman becomes a man running from pressure. Canfield understands this better than anyone. Gambling isn't a game of chance. Gambling is where things people dare not say during the day come alive at night. But Canfield also knows something else. If too many powerful people enter such a secret place, sooner or later someone will want to break it down. And that shadow is approaching. A name is appearing in the newspapers, a man who will later become Canfield's greatest enemy. But that's a story for the next part. As the Canfield Club reached the height of its power, as America's richest men spent their nights defying fate in his mansion, a storm began to brew on the other side of the city. A storm unlike any danger Canfield had ever faced. Not gangs, not police seeking more protection money, not competitors, but a man who believed New York had to be cleansed. A man who believed the law had to be the law. A man who believed that the more powerful the rich, the more they had to be punished. His name was William Travers Jerome. Jerome was born into a prestigious family of New York's elite. He didn't grow up in poverty. He didn't lack opportunities. But unlike many of his peers, Jerome didn't want to be a tycoon, nor did he want to be a wealthy politician. That he wanted to be a defender of public morality. When elected district attorney of New York County in 1901, Jerome entered the job with the fervent belief that the city was rotten by corruption, and to change that, he had to strike at the dens of that the protection racket was shielding. And of all those dens, one name was mentioned most often in secret reports, in whispers in City Hall, in articles by reformist journalists. Canfield's place on 44th Street. Richard Canfield's casino. Jerome was not easily swayed, not a bribe taker, not a symbolic blow taker. He wanted to dismantle the entire Tammany Hall protection racket, and Canfield was the biggest, most symbolic target. Because Canfield was more than just a casino owner, he was America's gambling king, who had transformed an illegal operation into a gentlemanly experience that the elite lived for. For Jerome, destroying Canfield wasn't just an achievement. It was a declaration. No one, not even the rich, is above the law. Jerome began with covert investigations. He tracked the flow of money. He noted the cars arriving at 44th Street at midnight. He sent undercover agents to nearby hotels, monitoring the regulars who frequented Canfield's residence. He gathered reports from disgruntled police officers that he approached journalists eager to find a moral bombshell to shake the city. Meanwhile, the Canfield Club continued to gleam every night, but the shadowy footsteps had begun to appear. The brilliant silence of 5 East 44th Street was being threatened by eyes eager to prove that behind that beauty lay something illegal. In November 1902, Jerome publicly declared in the press that he would sweep away the gambling dens catering to the upper class. The whole of Manhattan was shaken. Everyone understood. He wasn't targeting a few small gambling houses. He was talking about Canfield. The rich trembled. Those who had once confidently entered the Canfield Club now wondered if they should continue. Some worried about their reputations being ruined. Some wrote privately to Canfield asking if the situation was safe, and Canfield? He remained as calm as ever, as if Jerome were just one of many temporary figures passing through the stage of history. Canfield believed in two things. His long-standing protection racket would protect him in no one dared to directly attack the dens frequented by the tycoons. That on the second point, he was wrong, for Jerome didn't just want to attack. He wanted to create a model case, a sensational event, a victory that would etch his name into the history of the Reformation movement. And the day he had been waiting for finally arrived. On the evening of December 1st, 1902, Jerome's men were ready that a search warrant had been issued. Elite police forces were deployed around 44th Street. America's most luxurious casino was about to face the storm, named William Travers Jerome. Canfield had no idea that night, a seemingly ordinary night with the sound of roulette, the smell of cigars, and the aroma of wine, would be the night that shook the entire empire he had built over decades. The winds of reform had turned into a storm, and it's coming to 5 East 44th Street that on the night of December 1st, 1902, New York was shrouded in the early winter chill. The streetlights dimmed, snow dotted the sidewalks, and 44th Street was as quiet as any other night. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. The luxurious carriages still stopped in front of the Brown House at 5 East 44th Street, as they had done thousands of times before. But that night, there were people who came to 44th Street not to gamble. They came to end an era. William Travers Jerome had been preparing for this night for months. He had gathered sufficient evidence, assembled an elite police force, and, most importantly, chosen the time when the casinos were busiest, when the most powerful figures were inside. Not just to raid the casinos, but to expose the hypocrisy of New York's elite. Inside the Canfield Club, no one knew the storm was brewing. The lower floors were still bathed in warm yellow light. The waiters in formal attire glided about like shadows. Guests chatted softly, waiting to be invited upstairs to the gaming rooms, the third and fourth floors. The card rooms were already full. The soft rustling of cards, the clinking of chips on the table, the rhythmic spinning of the roulette wheel, all sounded like the breath of an invisible god. The atmosphere was so luxurious that no one could imagine that in just an hour, this place would become the scene of the most infamous raid in New York history. In the corner, as usual, Richard Canfield stood observing, calm and elegant. He didn't participate in the game, didn't interfere, didn't draw attention. He simply stood there like a silent director of a play where everyone else thought they were the main character. No one knew, not even Canfield, that the play was about to suddenly change scene. Around 11 p.m. at the end of the street, figures appeared. Not customers. They were police officers, but without the usual lazy air of the security forces. This was the special task force Jerome had chosen specifically to prevent information leaks. They didn't knock. They stormed in. The loud banging echoed like a slash through the luxurious silence of the house. Open the door. New York law. A moment of stunned silence. Then the customers in the card room changed their expressions. Surprise, panic, embarrassment. Three things they never wanted anyone to see. That Canfield's employees rushed into the emergency procedure they had practiced for years. Collect the cards, close the tables. Hide the chips, open the secret exit, but this time, it was too late. Jerome had surrounded all the exits. When the police stormed the second and third floors, New York's wealthiest men found themselves in a situation they had never experienced. Caught red-handed doing something they had tried to hide their whole lives. The card room descended into unprecedented chaos. Some tried to escape through the back door. Some tried to keep their backs straight, hoping to preserve their honor. Some covered their faces. Some were furious, shouting that they would talk to the higher-ups. But Jerome didn't care. He hadn't come to compromise. He had come to prove a historic statement. No one is above the law, not even you. And Canfield? He didn't run, that he didn't get angry, that he didn't argue. He didn't try to hide anything. He stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, watching his empire being turned upside down like someone who knew all too well that this day was bound to come sooner or later. An officer approached and read the order. Richard Albert Canfield, You are arrested for operating an illegal gambling establishment." Canfield smiled faintly, not a defiant smile, but the smile of someone accepting fate as an unavoidable gamble. Amidst the clamor of customers trying to conceal their faces, a policeman taking notes, another counting chips as if counting evidence, Jerome ascended the stairs and looked directly at Canfield. Two men, two symbols of two contrasting worlds, stood before each other. One representing sophistication, elegance, and the control of the rich's hidden desires. The other representing the openness, morality, law, and fury of the reform movement. The moment was like a climactic scene where the fate of an entire era was sealed, Jerome said. "It's time to get rid of these things from the city." Canfield replied, "I only provided what you yourselves sought. No argument, no justification, just two viewpoints that never met." Over 100 patrons were registered, dozens of gaming tables were sealed. Numerous works of art were listed as evidence. News of the raid spread throughout Manhattan in just a few hours. The press called it the raid on America's most beautiful casino, and the most powerful men who had once entered the Canfield Club with the air of royalty had to explain the next morning why their names were on the record. An era had been brought down from the house on 44th Street, and from that moment, Richard Canfield was no longer at his peak. He embarked on a new journey, the journey of a man pursued by law, public opinion, and history. The raid on the night of December 1st, 1902, not only shattered a night of gambling, it crumbled the impenetrable wall Richard Canfield had built over a decade. But the most dangerous thing wasn't the loss of money, the casino, or power. It was the impending courtroom trial, public, noisy, and full of enemies. Jerome, the mastermind behind the raid, knew all too well. If he could bring Canfield to justice, he would send shivers down Manhattan's spine. No one would have protection anymore. No one would be immune anymore. No respectable gentleman could shield Canfield. From the moment the raid made the front page of the major newspapers, the battle between the two men officially began. In the days that followed, Canfield was summoned to court. Reporters swarmed the steps. The whole city was buzzing about who the casino king would reveal. Who had ever been to 44th Street? Who placed the biggest bets? Were any politicians, businessmen, or congressmen on the list? A single testimony from Canfield could drag dozens of famous people down into the abyss. But Canfield stepped up to the witness stand with an attitude that astonished everyone. Calm, quiet, and absolutely uncooperative beyond what the law required him to say. Jerome asked directly, "Who gambled at your establishment?" Canfield looked up, his eyes calm as if reading a familiar hand of cards. "I don't know." Jerome pressed hard. "You're the owner of the establishment. How can you not know?" "Those who went there were my customers," Canfield replied, his voice even and clear, "and I never reveal the identities of my customers." The courtroom erupted in commotion. Some reporters noted. Canfield refused to betray anyone. Jerome continued, "Did you permit gambling?" "I did not permit anything illegal," Canfield replied, without a twitch of his face. That testimony wasn't blatant lying. It was the performance of someone who understood the law as well as he understood the rules. The law didn't require him to testify against his clients or himself. And Canfield clung to that loophole like a cunning old fox. For months, Jerome tried to force Canfield to open his mouth, because he knew that if Canfield remained silent, the whole system would remain silent. But if Canfield spoke, the whole system would collapse. But Canfield had never been considered the king of gambling, simply because of his wealth or intelligence. He possessed a quality few in the criminal world had: absolute loyalty to those who trusted him. Not a single name leaked out. Not a single guest was dragged into trouble by him. Not a single word hurt anyone who walked through the door of 44th Street. Jerome was furious, but he could do nothing against that wall of silence, because the law, the very thing Jerome relied on, also protected Canfield's right to remain silent. Jerome changed tactics. He couldn't break Canfield with testimony, so he would break him with time and money. A series of charges were brought: operating a gambling establishment, incitement to gambling, conspiracy to evade taxes, violation of public order regulations. Not all had legal basis, but the important thing wasn't to win each charge individually, but to drag Canfield into a long, costly legal battle that would drain both his will and his finances. Throughout 1903, 1904, and part of 1905, Canfield lived like a man of two worlds. By day, he appeared in court, elegant, composed, and maintaining the demeanor of a gentleman. By night, he watched 44th Street sink into silence, the former heart of the empire now sealed, without lights, without the sound of chips clattering against the table. Finally, Jerome got what he wanted. No need to imprison Canfield, just to make him unable to continue operating. In 1904, Canfield was sentenced to a fine, light by law, but heavy in meaning. Because the sentence came with a condition, he was not allowed to operate a casino in any form. The court did not send him to prison, but it dismissed him from his profession. Canfield understood that this was the end of his golden age. Although he was still wealthy, still owned art, and still respected by the upper class, he was no longer king. America was entering an era of reform. The window for a casino like 44th Street had closed forever. But what people will remember about that trial is not the verdict, not the fine, not the closure of the casino, but the image of Richard Canfield standing before hundreds of eyes, the press relentlessly reporting, Jerome attacking from all sides. And he remained silent to protect the honor of those who had sought him out in the shadows. People say, he lost the law, but he won the hearts of the people. A strange kind of victory. A great kind of defeat. A legend. After the 1904 trial, Richard Canfield left New York not as a defeated man, but as a dethroned king, walking out of his palace with dignity, yet maintaining the composure of someone who understood that every empire, sooner or later, must give way to a new era. The court banned him from running casinos in the city. The press hunted him down as a symbol of decadence. Jerome saw that victory as proof that the reforms were succeeding. But Canfield still had one place untouched. Saratoga Springs, the most luxurious summer resort in the East, where the elite flocked each year for horse racing, dining, signing financial deals, and gambling. Saratoga was not New York. The laws were more lenient, the atmosphere more relaxed, and the powerful preferred to escape. It was the playground Canfield had been building in parallel for years, a quiet, sophisticated fortress, and most importantly, untouched by Jerome. And so, after the fall of 44th Street, Saratoga became his final empire. Unlike New York, where nighttime was Canfield's moment, Saratoga operated seasonally. Summer arrived, and luxury cars from Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago poured into the small town. Hotels lit up, bars bustled, and the racetrack echoed with cheers. Then, as night fell, the darkness of Saratoga became Richard Canfield's second stage. His casino here, though smaller than 44th Street, still maintained its golden principles. Elegant ambience, courteous staff, excellent cuisine, no cheating, absolute discretion. Those who used to frequent 44th Street now seek out Saratoga as if searching for a lost, beautiful memory. They come not just to gamble, but to relive a part of the world that New York had stolen from them. For several years, Saratoga was where Canfield continued to breathe, continued to observe, continued to live in a world he understood better than anyone else. It was his last golden age, but no one can defeat the times. The Reformation spread from New York to Albany, and then down to Saratoga. New politicians, those wanting to prove their innocence, began targeting the town's gambling activity. And once again, the name Canfield appeared in investigative reports, not because he was troublesome, not because he cheated, not because he was violent, but because he was too famous. He was the symbol of high society gambling, and to prove the reform was effective, they needed to strike at that symbol. In 1907, New York state legislators passed new laws, tightening control over all gambling activities in the Saratoga area. Small-scale raids began, not as violent as in Manhattan, but as regular as a death knell. Canfield understood the signals. He had spent his life reading signals from people. Now he read signals from policy. His time was over. No angered, no resistance, no pleading that he simply closed. The Saratoga Casino, once a summer rendezvous for the wealthy, where laughter mingled with the clatter of cards, where he kept the last vestiges of his empire's soul, went dark. An era ended, quieter than New York, but more painful. From 1907 onward, Richard Canfield was no longer the secret king of lavish nights. He distanced himself from gambling, from the sound of chips, from the men who lost money, but he left with satisfaction that he returned to a life few would have expected. A serious art collector, an appreciator of beauty, a self-taught scholar, a gentleman at cultural events. But this transformation wasn't because he wanted to atone for his past. Not because he regretted it. Not because he wanted social acceptance. Canfield simply realized his gambling career had fulfilled its mission, but he hadn't. He still had a life to live, and for the first time since he was a young man standing in the New Bedford Library, he could live it without sacrificing secrecy, Saratoga concludes. But Richard Canfield, despite all the storms, is beginning to enter his final chapter, a chapter unexpectedly colored by art, philosophy, and tranquility. A chapter that few would have thought the king of gambling would belong to. When Saratoga closed in 1907, many thought Richard Canfield would disappear, like so many other gambling tycoons after their time had passed. But Canfield didn't disappear, he transformed. No more chips clattering, and no more faro tables, no more roulette, no more masked patrons, no more sleepless nights watching money flow toward him. Instead, there was the sound of turning pages. The sound of footsteps in an art gallery, the smell of old oil paint, and the stillness of a man who had once lived amidst chaos, now entering a world where beauty speaks slowly. As if Canfield had lived two lives, and the second life had just begun. In fact, the seeds of art had been sown years earlier. While running casinos in Providence, then New York, then Saratoga, Canfield quietly bought paintings, read art books, conversed with critics, and meticulously collected knowledge. But while running the casinos, that passion was secondary to his life. Now it came to the forefront that Canfield's day after 1907 didn't begin with calculating game probabilities, but with sketches by famous English painters, French Impressionist paintings, works of the early American school, and hours immersed in essays on European art. He bought paintings not to show off, not to increase the price, not to create a collection of a reformed gambler. He bought them because he truly knew which paintings were valuable, which had soul, which were beautiful only to those who didn't know, and which were beautiful to those who did. Canfield began to become a significant voice in the art world, without trying to attract attention. That he simply did what he always did, observing, studying, analyzing, and remaining silent to gain a deeper understanding of others, just as he had done with gamblers years before. The focal point of Canfield's artistic world remained the name he respected most, James McNeill Whistler. Whistler, with his refined, restrained, and meditative style, was the artistic soul that Canfield felt close to, and their friendship, though short-lived, became an indelible bond in Canfield's mind. He treasured the portrait Whistler painted of him, not just a work of art, but an acknowledgement. A great artist saw in him more than just the reputation of the casino tycoon. When Whistler died in 1903, Canfield was truly saddened, not because he had lost an artistic icon, but because he had lost someone who understood him in a way no one else in the world understood. Later, when the Whistler collection went on sale in London, Canfield quietly stood among the crowd to buy back the most important works, not for speculation, but to protect his friend's legacy. It was also during these years that he began to write, not a memoir, not an indictment, but an art study that he wrote about Whistler, about composition, about color, about style. His writings, though not flashy, were praised by critics as sharp, subtle, and insightful, as if the writer were a professional scholar, not someone who had once managed 50 card dealers. The quietude of his new life allowed him to delve deeper into philosophy, a passion he had loved since his youth. Schopenhauer, Kant, art for art's sake. These ideas blended together, creating a version of Richard Canfield that few had ever seen, a self-taught intellectual, living by contemplation, no longer by the desires of others. His friends said that in his later years, Canfield seemed at ease in no longer the vigilance of someone living in the shadows, and no longer stressed by bribery, protection rackets, or the law. No longer considering the psychology of gamblers, Canfield moved through the art world as if it were his true home. No one called him the king of gambling. They called him Collector Canfield. the man who understood Whistler best in America. A gentleman with an unusually refined artistic taste, whose origins no one could guess. Perhaps, deep down, it was the first time Richard Canfield had lived the life he chose. Not the life circumstances demanded, a second life, a life without secrecy. A life where past and present no longer clash, but blend together like two colors in an impressionist painting. But that journey was also coming to an end. Canfield still faced challenges, financial burdens, health concerns, and difficult decisions about his collection. His final path was slowly turning toward destiny, and the next chapter would be the final years of his life, quiet, beautifully melancholic, and symbolic of a man who had lived two lives. After leaving the world of gambling and finding a new life in art, Richard Canfield entered his final years not with regret, but with an unusual serenity. The glorious days in 44th Street were over. The sounds of roulette, chips, and clinking glasses of wine had become distant memories, but time never shows mercy to anyone, not even to someone who had won and lost at the table of life. His health began to decline, not because he was arrested, not because he lost money, not because he suffered pressure from the press. Canfield had lived his whole life under stress, but collapsed in his most peaceful years. His body, after decades of operating to the rhythm of nightlife, finally reacted. He suffered from cardiovascular problems, aches and pains, and weakness. His gait slowed. His voice also became softer. He spent much of his time at home, surrounded by Whistler paintings and the works he had painstakingly collected. At times, he would sit for hours before a portrait of himself painted by Whistler, as if conversing with an old friend. But that silence couldn't hide a bitter truth. His money was dwindling. Years of litigation, enormous legal fees, and the loss of income from Saratoga or New York had eroded his fortune. That Canfield's second life, his artistic life, was also beginning to suffer. His art collection had to be sold, piece by piece, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. He needed money to live, to pay bills, to maintain the simple but expensive lifestyle of someone accustomed to luxury. The paintings of Whistler, his respected friend, were put up for auction. Many works were acquired by museums. Others fell into the hands of new collectors. Each time a painting left his home, Canfield seemed to lose a part of his memory, that he still retained one thing. The unfinished portrait Whistler had painted of him. It wasn't material possessions, it was himself. A more refined, calmer, eternally younger version of the man sitting in the chair in 1914. The press occasionally mentioned Canfield selling paintings, but not in a mocking tone. Strangely, when he left the world of gambling, societal attitudes toward him also changed. He was no longer seen as the king of sin, but as an intriguing figure, two lives, one in the shadows and one in art. But then, fate dealt the final blow. On December 11th, 1914, at the 14th Street subway station in New York, a place thousands of people pass through every day, Richard Canfield was descending the stairs when he slipped out a simple slip. A seemingly harmless movement, but he fell backward, his head hitting the concrete floor hard. His skull fractured that he lost consciousness. Bystanders called an ambulance, but at the hospital, doctors knew they couldn't save him. The next day, Richard Albert Canfield died, at the age of 59. Not shot by police, not revenge from a rival, not a fateful card game, but a subway accident. The death of a man who had spent his life calculating risks came from the only thing he couldn't control, randomness. A cruel paradox. His funeral was quiet, no fanfare, no fuss. Few mourners attended, but all came out of respect. None of them mentioned gambling. They mentioned paintings. They mentioned Whistler. They mentioned the profound conversations he had with them in his final years. That a life of two chapters ended with an unexpected period. Not as dramatic as the 1902 raid. Not as glorious as the Golden Knights, but more meditative, more down-to-earth, more human than anything else. Richard Canfield left the world as he had lived most of his life. Quietly, self-controlled, and never complaining about fate. But his story is not over. For after Canfield's death, something strange happened. His legacy, a goal he never intentionally sought to build throughout his life, began to take shape. And that's the story of the next part. When Richard Canfield died in December 1914, New York City barely paused. There were no endless funeral processions, no headlines in newspapers, no eulogies from scholars or politicians. He left this world almost silently, much like how he had appeared in the lives of the wealthy, arrived softly, departed quietly, but left an indelible mark. Months after his death, a question began to emerge. What did Richard Canfield really leave for America? No more casinos, no more vast fortunes, no more empires, no more glittering 44th Street nights. But paradoxically, his value began to become clearer than ever. Point 1. His material legacy has almost vanished, but it has been preserved by art. Of all his creations, only a small fraction has survived to modern times. A portrait painted by Whistler, currently on display at the Cincinnati Art Museum. Visitors standing before the painting today may not know that the man in the black suit once ran America's most beautiful secret casino. They only see a calm, wise, steadfast face, almost a philosopher. No one knows that behind those eyes lies a soul that has lived 2 lives. Other works from his collection are scattered throughout museums in Boston, New York, Chicago, and several private collections. Many of these works are highly valued, exhibited, and preserved, but very few know that they once hung in a secret casino in Manhattan. Art, not gambling, ultimately became what keeps his name. 2. The 44th Street Legacy. A legend without a trace. The brownstone gambling den, where tycoons once gathered, has long been demolished. There are no memorial plaques, no bronze plaques, no archaeological remains for future generations to examine. That if you walk past 5 East 44th Street today, you'll see a modern office building. Those who walk through those doors can't possibly imagine that. Whistler's whistles once hung there. French chef dinners once served tycoons. Bets equivalent to millions of dollars today once changed hands right in the room they're standing in. That an entire world has vanished without a trace. But the legend of it lives on. In books, in old newspapers, in the memory of American criminal history. That it could be said. 44th Street is no longer on the map, but it remains in our minds. 3. Moral legacy. The paradox of a gentleman in the shadows. Richard Canfield was a living paradox. He ran an illegal operation, but did it cleaner, more honest, and more civilized than anyone before him. He profited from the desires of others, but never cheated them. He had the power to ruin the reputations of dozens of tycoons, but he never said a word. Even Jerome, who destroyed Canfield's empire, acknowledged that he possessed an extraordinary honor in the world of the dishonorable. Perhaps that is why, when he died, no one stood up to denounce him. No one called him a criminal. People only called him a remarkable figure, a gentleman in the illegal trade, a gentleman in the shadows. No one knows if he felt proud of it or not, but he certainly wasn't ashamed. 4. Cultural legacy. The indirect legitimization of the American gambling world. There's an irony to it all. The very things that once drove Canfield to the brink of ruin, today they've become a legitimate, multi-billion-dollar industry. Las Vegas sprang up in the desert. Atlantic City became an entertainment hub. Casinos appeared in dozens of states. Poker, roulette, and baccarat were televised live. Online gambling became a massive industry. Looking back, the big question arises. Was Canfield simply born too early, a business genius in an era that didn't allow such genius to exist openly? If he had lived 30 years later, perhaps 44th Street would have become New York's first legal casino, a Wynn or Bellagio of the Gilded Age. His legacy, in a broader sense, is proof that Americans have always wanted to gamble. The issue wasn't gambling, it was who ran it. Canfield ran it in the most elegant, honest way his time allowed. Point 5. And finally, the greatest legacy, the story of a man. Richard Canfield left no castle, no monument, and no corporation, but he left a story about a self-taught young man in a dark library, a genius at reading human psychology, a gambling king who knew honor, a sophisticated art collector, a man who lived 2 paradoxical lives. That story, though little told, still leaves one wondering. Who was he really? A criminal? A gentleman? A victim of his time? Or was he simply a seeker of beauty, in art, and in moments when human nature is revealed in its truest form? Perhaps, like all complex historical figures, Richard Canfield lies somewhere in between. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years after his death, he is still remembered, not as a criminal, but as an unclassifiable legend that a portrait remains in a museum that a building has vanished. An empire has been wiped out, but the story lives on.